April 14, 1945. Central Germany. The air is thick with the scent of pine needles, wet earth, and the acrid, lingering metallic tang of cordite. In the Thuringian forest, the morning mist clings to the charred remains of a Wehrmacht convoy, its skeletal frames still smoldering. The silence of the woods is broken not by birdsong, but by the heavy, rhythmic churning of distant diesel engines and the occasional crackle of burning rubber. Under the canopy of ancient oaks, a small group of women dressed in the gray-blue uniforms of the Deutsches Rotes Kreuz, the German Red Cross, stand huddled together. Their aprons, once a pristine clinical white, are now mapped with the dark, stiffening stains of old blood and the grime of a weeks-long retreat. For these nurses, the war had become a sequence of shrinking horizons. They had spent years moving through the flickering shadows of field hospitals, working by candlelight as the Allied air forces dismantled the electrical grids of the Reich. They were accustomed to the sound of artillery, the sight of gangrene, and the hollowed-out eyes of teenage boys conscripted to hold back the tide of an unstoppable collapse. To them, the world was a place of managed scarcity, a universe where a single clean bandage was a treasure and a vial of morphine was a miracle that happened only to the lucky few. As the first olive-drab jeeps of the U.S. Third Army crest the ridge, the nurses expect the worst. Their propaganda had painted a vivid, terrifying picture of the Americans: disorganized, materialistic, and brutal. They expected to be treated as the spoils of war, or at best, to be ignored while they starved in an improvised stockade. They believed the Americans were merely a collection of disparate individuals held together by machines, lacking the iron discipline and sacrificial spirit of the German soul. They stood with their heads bowed, bracing for the impact of a new, perhaps more violent, occupation. Instead, they find themselves caught in the wake of a logistical hurricane. The Americans do not arrive with the desperate, frantic energy of a raiding party, but with the terrifyingly calm efficiency of a mobile civilization. As the nurses are rounded up, they are not met with the butt of a rifle, but with the cool, professional gaze of a U.S. Army Medical Corps captain. He speaks no German, but his gestures are clear. They are moved not toward a cage, but toward a bustling encampment where enormous canvas tents are being erected with a speed that defies their understanding of construction. In this moment, the ground shifts beneath their feet. They see soldiers who are not gaunt or ragged, but well-fed and equipped with tools the nurses hadn't seen in years. The background noise of the war changes. It is no longer the scream of the Stuka or the rumble of a Tiger tank, but the constant, industrial hum of generators and the clatter of metal crates being unloaded from an endless stream of trucks. This is the beginning of a profound realization. For years, they had been told that Germany's strength was its will, its blood, and its soil. But as they watch the American colossus unfurl its medical wings in the middle of a forest, they begin to suspect that the war was decided not in the trenches, but on the assembly lines of a continent they had never seen. The reality of their situation is not just capture, but a collision with a future they are not yet prepared to understand. To understand the shock of these women, one must look back at the institution that shaped them. The Deutsches Rotes Kreuz had been more than a medical organization. Since 1933, it had been systematically synchronized into the machinery of the Third Reich. These nurses were the daughters of a state that demanded total war, a philosophy that prioritized the front-line soldier as a tool of conquest rather than a life to be preserved at all costs. By 1945, the German medical system was a crumbling relic of its former efficiency. The nurses had survived the brutal winters of the Eastern Front, where they had learned to perform amputations without anesthetics and to treat frostbite with nothing more than paper fiber bandages and hope. The historical reality of the German Medical Corps by the war's end was one of desperate, creative survival. Shortages were not just common. They were the defining characteristic of their service. Rubber for surgical gloves had become a luxury of the past, forcing nurses to plunge their bare hands into the viscera of the wounded. Even basic antiseptics like iodine had been rationed until they were virtually non-existent, replaced by harsh, makeshift substitutes that often did as much harm as good. They had been taught that this deprivation was a badge of honor, a testament to the German spirit's ability to triumph over material lack. They were the Brown sisters, conditioned to believe that the strength of their ideology would compensate for the emptiness of their supply chests. In the German military mind, the American soldier was viewed as a pampered amateur, a man who relied on gadgets and heavy industry because he lacked the stomach for true combat. The German High Command's records from the period reflect a deep-seated belief that the American material superiority was a sign of weakness. They assumed that once the Americans faced the harsh realities of the field, the mud, the blood, and the scarcity, they would fold. The nurses shared this skepticism. They expected to find the American medical units in a state of similar disarray, perhaps even more so, given their distance from home. They imagined the Americans would be scrambling for supplies, struggling to maintain order in the chaos of a foreign land. This cultural conditioning had created a psychological wall between the nurses and their captors. They viewed themselves as the weary veterans of a superior civilization that had simply run out of time and resources. They looked at the Americans not as liberators or even as competent foes, but as lucky intruders who had yet to be tested by the true crucible of war. They did not yet realize that the American philosophy of war was built on a foundation of logistical omnipotence. For the United States, a wounded soldier was not just a broken tool, but a citizen whose life was worth the full weight of the nation's industrial output. As the nurses are led deeper into the American lines, the historical evidence of this fundamental difference begins to manifest in every crate, every vehicle, and every well-rested face they encounter. The stage was set for a confrontation not of arms, but of values, centered on the most basic human act, the tending of a wound. They would soon learn that the American weakness for comfort and abundance was, in fact, an insurmountable strategic weapon. The nurses are escorted to a sprawling clearing where the U.S. Army's mobile evacuation hospital has established itself with the permanence of a small city. The scene is a chaotic symphony of organized power. Massive 6x6 trucks back into position with a hiss of air brakes, unloading prefabricated surgical flooring and generators that purr with a steady, reliable rhythm. For the German women, the emotional contrast is jarring. They had expected a primitive camp, perhaps a collection of dirt-floored lean-tos similar to the makeshift stations they had operated in the ruins of Frankfurt. Instead, they find themselves standing before vast, olive-drab canvas cathedrals, internally lit by bright, electric surgical lamps that banish the gloom of the overcast German afternoon. There is no sense of the frantic, panicked triage that characterized the German retreat. While the American medics move with speed, it is a speed born of confidence rather than desperation. The nurses observe the GIs, with a mixture of suspicion and awe. The American orderlies are dressed in clean fatigue jackets, their boots are sturdy and intact, and they carry themselves with a casualness that the nurses find almost offensive. To the German eye, disciplined soldiers should be stiff, formal, and visibly burdened by the weight of their duty. These Americans, however, whistle while they work, chewing gum and trading jokes as they snap together the frames of folding cots. The nurses are initially kept in a holding area near the receiving ward, where the true scale of the American humanitarian effort begins to dawn on them. Ambulances arrive every few minutes, their sirens muted by the vastness of the woods. From each vehicle, casualties are unloaded with a level of care that seems almost excessive to women used to the survival of the fittest mentality of the Reich. They watch as a wounded private is wrapped in multiple wool blankets and his boots are carefully removed, not to be salvaged for another soldier, as would be the case in the Wehrmacht, but simply to ensure his comfort. In the shadows of the receiving tent, the nurses whisper among themselves, their voices brittle with suppressed emotion. They had been told that the Americans were a soft people, incapable of enduring the hardships of a European winter. Yet, looking at the heat rising from the portable stoves and the steam billowing from the field kitchen nearby, they realized the Americans didn't endure the hardship. They simply brought their own climate with them. This realization is a psychological blow. The German nurses had prided themselves on their ability to suffer alongside their patients. Seeing the Americans refuse to suffer, to insist on warmth, light, and cleanliness even in the heart of a combat zone, feels like a betrayal of the laws of war they had lived by. They begin to understand that they are not just prisoners of a superior army, but witnesses to a superior method of existence, one where the individual's life is defended by a mountain of steel and silk. The fear of their captors begins to be replaced by a deeper, more unsettling fear. The fear that everything they had sacrificed for was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what a nation could achieve. As the nurses are moved from the periphery into the operational heart of the hospital, they encounter the staggering reality of American medical supply lines. For the German Red Cross sisters, who had spent the last 2 years stretching a single roll of gauze across 10 patients, the sight of the supply depot is nothing short of hallucinatory. In the German army, logistics were often a matter of horse-drawn carts and desperate improvisation. Here, it is a relentless, motorized flood of abundance. They watch as crates are pried open, revealing thousands of vials of morphine, not the diluted, precious droplets they were used to, but standardized, potent doses, available in such quantities that even the lowliest medic carries a personal satchel full of them. The nurses stand paralyzed by the sight of the blood bank. In the German service, blood transfusions were rare, high-risk procedures often requiring a direct line from a donor to a recipient in the middle of a bombardment. In this American tent, however, they see rows of glass bottles containing clear, life-saving plasma and whole blood, chilled by portable refrigeration units that hum with a defiant, constant energy. They witness a young American technician casually handling a tray of penicillin, the miracle drug that the German medical establishment had heard of only in whispers and rumors. To the nurses, this is not just medicine, it is alchemy. They realize that the Americans are not fighting the infections of war with willpower alone, but with a scientific and industrial superiority that renders the German struggle almost primitive by comparison. Historical data from the European Theater of Operations confirms that by 1945, the U.S. Army Medical Department was managing over 100,000 different supply items. The German nurses, peering into the open backs of the supply trucks, see everything from surgical silk and stainless steel hemostats to specialized orthopedic frames. There is no evidence of the ersatz or substitute culture that had poisoned German industry. Everything is of the highest quality, standardized for efficiency, and packaged with a disregard for cost that deeply unsettles the nurses. They watch as a medic accidentally drops a glass syringe. Instead of panicking or attempting to salvage the shards, he simply reaches into a nearby bin and pulls out a new one, still sealed in its protective casing. This display of material wealth creates a profound sense of cognitive dissonance. The nurses had been taught that the decadence of the West would lead to its downfall, yet here that very decadence is being used to save lives with a clinical, terrifying precision. They see that the American abundance is not merely a byproduct of geography, but a deliberate choice of a democratic society to invest in the survival of its citizens. The sheer volume of supplies becomes a psychological weight, pressing down on their belief in the national community they had served. They begin to understand that while Germany had invested its resources in the tools of death, the V-2 rockets and the heavy tanks, the Americans had invested equally in the tools of life. This realization is a silent, internal catastrophe for the women, as they begin to see the true face of the power that has defeated them. In the center of this industrial miracle sits a small, unassuming object that quickly becomes the focal point of the nurse's obsession, the individual, sterile field dressing packet. To a German nurse in 1945, a bandage was a sacred relic. 4 years, the German Red Cross had been forced to reclaim used dressings from the wounded, boiling them in communal vats until the stains of old infections faded to a dull, sickly yellow, then drying them on wooden racks to be used again and again. They had learned to weave bandages from wood pulp and paper, materials that disintegrated the moment they became saturated with sweat or blood. A clean, cotton bandage was, in their world, a luxury that indicated a soldier of high rank or a hospital of exceptional standing. Now, they watch in a state of near-physical shock as American medics treat these items with a casual, almost reckless indifference. A U.S. corporal, his sleeves rolled up to reveal a tattoo of an anchor, reaches into a cardboard carton and pulls out a small, tan-colored pouch. With a sharp flick of his wrists, he tears the waterproof seal. Inside is a pristine, snow-white dressing, complete with long olive-drab ties. He applies it to a soldier's superficial shrapnel wound, and then, without a second thought, he tosses the outer packaging and a few excess strips of gauze into a growing pile of refuse. For the German women, this act is a form of blasphemy. They watch the trash heap with wide, disbelieving eyes. In that pile lies more high-quality cotton and waterproof paper than their entire battalion had seen in a month of fighting. They see the recurring symbol of American power not in the tanks or the planes, but in this disposable culture. To discard something so perfect, so sterile, and so functional implies a supply chain that is not just full, but overflowing. It suggests a nation where the factories never sleep and where the sheep and cotton fields of a distant, unscarred continent are working solely to provide for this one medic, in this one tent, in this one forest. The symbolic weight of the disposable bandage begins to tear at their psychological defenses. It represents a fundamental shift in the value of the individual. In the German system, the soldier was expected to sacrifice his comfort and his health for the state. The state gave him only what it could spare. In the American system, the state seemed to exist to serve the soldier, providing him with a fresh, sterile start for every wound, no matter how minor. One nurse reaches out, her fingers trembling, to touch a discarded wrapper near her boot. The paper is thick, waxy, and completely moisture-proof, a triumph of packaging engineering. She realizes that the Americans have solved the problem of infection through sheer, overwhelming volume. They don't fight the germs, they simply replace the environment. This realization is a silent, bitter pill. The scarcity they had lived through wasn't a noble sacrifice. It was a failure of a system that could not provide the basic dignity of a clean cloth to its dying sons. The bandage, white and pure, stands as a silent witness to the truth. They were not just outfought, they were outproduced by a society that valued the individual enough to make excellence disposable. The nurses are soon brought into a theater of instruction that they find both bewildering and humiliating. A U.S. Army surgeon, a man whose hands are scrubbed raw and whose eyes reflect the exhaustion of 1,000 surgeries, gestures for them to gather around a portable operating table. He does not treat them as prisoners to be interrogated, but as students to be re-educated. Through a translator, he explains the American doctrine of sanitation. For the German women, who considered themselves the peak of European medical professionalism, the lesson begins with a shock to their foundational knowledge. The surgeon demonstrates the American method of debridement and the application of sulfonamide powder, but it is his insistence on the use of fresh, sterile materials for every single step that leaves them breathless. In the German medical tradition, sterilization was an arduous process of boiling and steaming, often compromised by the rush of the front or the lack of fuel. Here, the surgeon simply reaches for a pre-sealed tray. He explains that in the American Army, the risk of cross-contamination is considered a greater threat than the enemy's bullets. The nurses watch as he demonstrates the first aid lesson on a wounded American sergeant. To their eyes, the amount of equipment used for a single leg wound is staggering. The surgeon uses 3 different pairs of forceps, discarding each into a wash basin after a single use. He consumes an entire packet of the recurring symbol, the white, sterile field dressings, just to pack a minor cavity. The most profound part of the lesson, however, is not the technique, but the philosophy of care. The surgeon explains that even a prisoner of war receives the same sterilized equipment, the same high-grade morphine, and the same attention from a board-certified doctor. This is the moment where the German/Japanese soldiers' expectation of American cruelty is utterly dismantled. The nurses had been prepared to witness the Americans neglecting their own wounded in favor of efficiency. Instead, they see a system that treats every life as a critical investment. The historical evidence of this care is visible in the American survival rates, which were significantly higher than those of the Axis powers. One nurse, Greta, watches as the surgeon throws away a roll of adhesive tape because the edge had touched the floor. In her old unit, that tape would have been wiped with a damp cloth and used until the last centimeter. To see it discarded as compromised is a revelation of a world where the standard is perfection, not just good enough. The Americans are not just teaching them how to tie a bandage. They are teaching them that in a democracy, the resources of the entire nation are at the service of the individual's recovery. The nurses realize that their own superior training was actually a training in how to manage failure. The American lesson is a training in how to achieve victory over death through the application of unlimited wealth. As the surgeon finishes and walks away to the next table, the nurses stand in a silence that is heavy with the weight of their own outdated world. They are no longer just observing a hospital. They are observing the death of their own ideology, one sterile bandage at a time. The contrast between the two worlds is perhaps most visible in the physical toll of the struggle. For the German nurses, medical care had become a ritual of scarcity and exhaustion. They recalled the late-stage field hospitals of the Reich, where the lack of coal meant that surgery was performed in rooms so cold that the breath of the doctors obscured their vision. They remembered using rusted, dull needles that tore through skin, and the haunting smell of paper bandages that, when soaked with serum, became a breeding ground for infection. In their world, the scarcity was framed as a spiritual necessity, a way for the German people to prove their mettle against a materialistic world. They had been convinced that their ability to endure the unendurable was their greatest strength. But as they stand within the humming warmth of the American tent, that narrative begins to crumble. They look at the American equipment, the gleaming chrome of the autoclave units, the sturdy, padded litters, and the abundance of clean, white linens, and they see not decadence, but a profound respect for human life. The historical data of the time reflects a massive disparity in resource allocation. While the German logistics system was struggling to provide even the most basic calories to its frontline medical staff, the Americans were importing entire prefabricated laboratories and X-ray suites. The nurses realized that the materialism they were taught to despise is actually a shield. It is a shield that prevents the surgeon's hand from shaking due to cold and keeps the patient's wound from rotting for lack of a clean cloth. The recurring symbol of the sterile bandage haunts their reflections. They think of the thousands of German soldiers who died of sepsis in the mud of the East simply because there were no clean dressings to be had. They compare those deaths to the scene before them, where a young American medic uses a fresh, sterile packet to wipe away a smear of dirt from a soldier's forehead. The casualness of the gesture is what stings the most. It reveals that for the Americans, cleanliness is not a luxury to be prayed for, but a standard to be expected. The nurses begin to feel the weight of a terrible truth. Their sacrifice was not noble, it was unnecessary. They were victims of a regime that romanticized poverty because it had failed to master production. In this quiet moment of reflection, the nurses look at their own hands, reddened, scarred, and used to the friction of recycled gauze. They realize that they have been fighting a war of the 19th century against a power of the 20th. The American philosophy of abundance has rendered their stoicism obsolete. They see that democracy does not just offer freedom of speech, it offers the industrial capacity to ensure that a man does not have to die simply because a piece of cloth is too expensive to replace. This shift in perception is a slow, agonizing process. They are mourning not just the loss of their country, but the loss of their pride. They see now that the true master race is the one that can provide a sterile bandage for every citizen, even in the middle of a forest, in the middle of a war. The theoretical lessons and the observations of supply depots finally collide with a visceral, human reality when a new ambulance arrives. From the back of the vehicle, a stretcher is pulled out carrying a boy who cannot be older than 16. He wears the tattered, oversized tunic of the Hitler Youth, his face masked by a thick layer of road dust and the pale, waxy sheen of traumatic shock. His leg is a ruin of shredded muscle and bone, the result of a stray American shell hitting a desperate rearguard position. This is a Volkssturm soldier, the final, pathetic scrapings of the German barrel. In any German field hospital in 1945, this boy would have been marked with a black cross on his forehead, a signal for expectant death, and moved to a corner to die quietly, as his survival would require resources that the Reich simply did not have. The German nurses watch, breathless, as the American medical team reacts. There is no hesitation, no calculation of the boy's value to the war effort, and no resentment of his uniform. Instead, he is rushed into the surgical tent with the same intensity as if he were a 5-star general. The nurses are called upon to assist, and it is here that they witness the ultimate manifestation of American abundance. The recurring symbol, the sterile dressing, is used in a frantic, beautiful excess. They watch as packs are torn open one after another to stem the hemorrhage. They see the boy's graying skin flush with color as bottle after bottle of refrigerated American plasma is pumped into his veins. One nurse, Maria, holds the boy's hand while the surgeon works. She calculates the cost of this one life in her head. The penicillin, the high-grade anesthetics, the sterile instruments, the hours of labor from highly trained men. She realizes that the Americans are spending more material wealth to save this one German teenager than his own government spent to equip his entire platoon. The historical irony is sharp and bitter. The regime that claimed to cherish its youth had sent him out to die with a cardboard-bound rifle and a paper bandage. The enemy he was told to hate was now using the full weight of its industrial heart to bring him back from the brink. As the boy stabilizes, his breathing evening out under the rhythmic hiss of an oxygen mask, the nurses are struck by a crushing wave of clarity. This is the turning point of their ideology. They see that the American material superiority is not just a logistical advantage, it is a moral one. It is an expression of a society that views every individual life as an asset worth any price. They look at the pile of discarded, bloody, but once sterile wrappers on the floor and they no longer see waste. They see a testament to a civilization that has conquered the cruelty of nature through the power of its assembly lines. The boy lives not because of a miracle, but because a factory in Ohio made enough bandages to ensure that even a wounded enemy would never have to touch a dirty cloth. In this realization, the nurse's loyalty to the old order finally dissolves, replaced by a profound, quiet respect for the generosity of their conquerors. The nurses sit in the dimming light of the evening, watching the shift change within the American medical city. The transformation of their ideology is now complete, solidified by the quiet, efficient reality of the day's work. They discuss in hushed tones the fundamental revelation they have shared, that the strength of a nation is not measured by the ferocity of its soldiers or the rigidity of its discipline, but by its capacity for compassion backed by industrial might. They realize that the total war they had been part of was a hollow promise, a system that demanded everything from the individual but lacked the means to protect them when they fell. The American model, which they had initially dismissed as soft and materialistic, has proven itself to be a more profound expression of human value. This realization redefines their understanding of democracy. To these women, democracy is no longer an abstract political concept debated in distant halls. It is the physical presence of that sterile, white bandage. It is the logistical miracle that ensures a doctor never has to choose between two dying men because he only has one clean cloth. They see that the American abundance is not a sign of greed, but a tool of liberation. By removing the terror of scarcity, the Americans have removed the necessity for the cruel, utilitarian choices that had defined the German medical experience. They begin to see that a society that can produce in such excess is a society that can afford to be kind. The nurses look at the American medics not as barbarians, but as the vanguard of a new world. They see that the Americans have brought more than just weapons to Germany. They have brought a philosophy where the state is the servant of the individual's survival. The historical data of the post-war era would eventually show how this realization spread through the occupied territories, forming the psychological bedrock for the reconstruction of a peaceful Europe. For the nurses, the war has ended not with a bang, but with the tearing of a paper seal. The ideological walls have fallen, replaced by a vision of a future where no one is considered expendable. They watch the surgeons scrub out, their faces weary but their hands steady. The nurses understand now that the true victory of the United States was not just a victory of arms, but a victory of production and purpose. They see that the ability to provide for the wounded is the ultimate proof of a civilization's legitimacy. As they prepare for their own rest, they look once more at the supply crates stacked high against the canvas walls. Those boxes are the monuments of a new era. The nurses recognize that they have been captured by an army, but they have been liberated by an idea. The idea that every human life is worth a fresh, sterile dressing, and that a nation's greatest glory is its ability to save its people from the indignity of a dirty wound. The war did not end for these women with the signing of a treaty or the lowering of a flag. It ended when they realized that the world they had served was built upon a lie of necessary suffering. As the fires of the Third Reich faded into the cold ash of history, the lessons learned in that canvas hospital remained. The nurses would return to a broken Germany, but they would carry with them a new standard of care, one that would eventually become the foundation of the post-war medical system. They had witnessed the true power of a free society, not in its ability to destroy, but in its refusal to let even its enemies go without the dignity of a clean cloth. The recurring symbol of the white, sterile bandage serves as a final, poetic reflection on the nature of the conflict. It was an object that represented the absolute triumph of democracy's logistics over the desperation of totalitarianism. In its simple, disposable perfection, it held the promise of a future where abundance was used to serve the individual rather than the state. The nurses had come to the forest expecting to be treated as prisoners of a cruel master. They left as witnesses to a civilization that viewed every life as a critical investment.